Spring is the season of romance, and what says romance more than the exploitation trilogy sired by the shared demented brain of Grindhouse Cinema's favorite couple? I'm Alma Langlois, and today I'm talking about The Touch of Her Flesh, the first in the sexploitation trilogy produced, written, directed, edited by, and starring Michael Findlay as Richard Jennings, the anti-hero for our deranged times. We're diving straight into the id and seedy underbelly of New York City, so if you're the type who needs a trigger warning...
Suck on this.
Of course, he's not credited as Michael Findlay. Everyone who worked on this film used an alias. For his performance in the film, he's credited as Robert West. But for his writer, director, editor, and producer credit, he used the pseudonym Julian Marsh, which is a reference to the director character in one of Michael's favorite films, 42nd Street. Roberta, who co-produced, did the cinematography, lighting, and makes uncredited appearances as the nude female body in the film's credits, and Richard Jennings' nude fantasy woman, she used the pseudonym Anna Riva. How the two met is surprisingly cute. Roberta, a concert pianist since the age of 12, was a City College student who answered a job ad for a piano player to accompany a silent film series. When she arrived at the interview, she met the curator of the film series, Michael Findlay.
Oh, I like that.
I can see the attraction. The two shared creativity, a cynical sense of humor, debilitating anxiety, and painful childhood trauma. When interviewed about her relationship with Michael by Ashley West of Rialto Report, Roberta said, "For a time, we only had one another, so we clung to each other. There was no calm, sensible person in our relationship, and therefore all our problems were amplified. Our scars, fears, obsessions, phobias, and neuroses. And we had a lot of them. We weren't normal people." Of her late husband, she also said, "He was a film nut, a true cinephile. He knew more about film history than anybody I've ever met." The Findlay's film career begins with fellow filmmaker John Amaro. Amaro struck up a friendship with Michael when the two of them were working for ABC. Amaro recalls, "Though he was painfully shy, we hit it off right away. It was clear that he had an enormous knowledge and passion for movies, so we talked endlessly about films." The two became fast friends, taking their lunch breaks together and meeting for drinks after work to discuss movies. Amaro noted that they loved many of the same films, although Amaro was more interested in the big spectacle of Hollywood productions, while Michael was more interested in the racier elements. Michael also struggled with anxiety and suffered from frequent panic attacks. Amaro writes in his autobiography, "He was wildly neurotic by nature and full of Catholic guilt and repressed feelings, all of which were tempered by regular doses of Valium. But there was something about him that I found endearing and fascinating." Amaro remembers Michael and Roberta as the only couple I knew who always walked together hand in hand or linking arms. Mike and Roberta clung to each other emotionally as well as physically. Both had anxious personalities and were terrified of many things. But whatever their idiosyncrasies, I liked them both enormously and always looked forward to spending time with them. The ambitions of the two aspiring filmmaker friends differed in one way. Amaro wanted to make a big-budget Hollywood picture, while Michael wanted to direct an independent feature. Michael convinced Amaro that the best way to get started in the business was to make it an exploitation film. Using funds from their ABC salaries, they shot Body of a Female in Amaro's hometown of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Out of necessity, Amaro's brother Lem and Michael played the leads, with Roberta performing the role of Cindy the stripper. While Amaro, Michael, and Roberta all shared a desire to make more films, Amaro wanted to move towards exploitation films that were lighter in tone, while Michael and Roberta were drawn to the darker elements of the genre. While Amaro and the Findlays parted ways professionally, Amaro writes, "Our friendship was unaffected by the split and remained as strong as ever. We continued to see each other regularly and swap film ideas, and Mike and Roberta were a good team. They started to collaborate on scripts, and Roberta expressed a desire to be the camera person on their films." Michael and Roberta turned their attention to making roughies, a particular type of exploitation film that combines sex with sadistic violence. After making the pseudo-documentary The Sin Syndicate for Joe Brenner, Satan's Bed starring then-unknown Yoko Ono, and the semi-remake of Body of a Female, Take Me Naked, in 1967, the Findlays made what would be the first of the Flesh trilogy for exploitation distributor Stan Borden, Touch of Her Flesh. Touch introduces our favorite anti-hero, Richard Jennings, a weapons expert who gets called out of town frequently to speak at conventions, leaving his buxom artist wife Claudia on her lonesome. Unfortunately, he finds out Claudia is not too lonesome and more than lacking in the loyalty department.
When's your husband getting back from Boston, Claudia?
Not for a week. He's going to be fooling around with his knives and guns. When he wrote that book about weapons, every convention in the country was after him.
How do you know he won't be fooling around with girls?
Are you kidding? He doesn't have anything to fool around with.
With all those weapons, he could be a real lady killer.
He couldn't shoot his way out of a rubber bag.
When he catches her with another man, he flees the apartment, only to be struck by a car, permanently disfigured and temporarily crippled.
What happened?
You were hit by a car and hurt very badly, but you'll be all right.
I can't move.
You're going to be all right. You were hit by a car and hurt very badly. Your legs will be paralyzed for a while, but it looks as if it won't last too long. You've lost one of your eyes. I'm terribly sorry.
Betrayed, bitter, and with a broken body, Richard Jennings spirals into madness. And some fantastic purple pulp prose.
And then, just as the heat of his now insane love is ready to burst upon her, she cuts his love in two, castrating his will, subjecting him to her desires, making him a crying, bleeding slave who cannot move unless she bids him move.
We're a big dime store novel fan, aren't we, Mike? Armed with his weapons expertise, Jennings is hell-bent on revenge, not only against Claudia, but against all loose, amoral women.
One by one, and the first shall receive a rose to symbolize the innocent pubescence that she once had. But its thorns shall be impregnated with the poisonous venom she herself dispenses. And this symbol of her once virginity shall kill the whore.
No go-go dancer or stripper is safe. Can your heart stand the shocking horror of the wrath of Richard Jennings? While the genesis of the slasher film can be traced back to Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, published in 1939, and probably even further back to the Grand Guignol Theater in turn-of-the-century Paris, Touch of the Flesh contains elements that are precursors to the modern slasher film. There's the traumatic event that sets off a violent killing spree, a murderer dispatching a series of victims in creative ways, and victims being punished for their sins. With Richard Jennings' quest to punish loose women, some have accused the film of being misogynistic, a cinematic iteration of the sexist male desire to control female sexuality.
What's wrong with being sexy? I mean, there's no trouble with
Sexist.
But I think it's more complicated than that. I think the film expresses male anxieties about women, fears of rejection, of not being attracted to women, fears of heartbreak by betrayal, fears of being deemed sexually inadequate, and fears of being emasculated by your partner. In this respect, promiscuous women are more dangerous to a man. I know we're all supposed to celebrate skags now, but in general, promiscuous women are also unstable, lacking in loyalty, and more likely to hurt them by trading in for a new model.
We just wondered where you were planning to spread your VD today, that's all, hussy.
And to top it off, most of those women are annoying. Not only do they have to pollute the world with their stupid, self-centered serial dating, now they've got to act all self-righteous about it too.
Children would only get in the way of our erotic lifestyle.
There's also the fear of being compromised and made vulnerable by their intense sexual desire for a woman, or as Jennings eloquently puts it, trapped in the sexual vortex of the female being. The film also expresses conflicted feelings about sex. There's an attraction, a fascination with sex, but sex is also dirty and animalistic. There's also a preoccupation with sin and punishment. I think it's a duh that Michael's purging some of the angst from his strict Catholic upbringing. I love a tortured Catholic artist. I'm only half Catholic. My father's Catholic and my mother's Presbyterian, so I'm just confused. But I feel really guilty about it. That's not to say that purging your demons with your art can't be fun. One of the things I love about the Flesh movies is that they're imbued with a sardonic, cynical sense of humor and a gleefully warped sensibility that would become more pronounced throughout the trilogy. I also think the Findlays made creative use of their limited budget, employing more visual style than many of their contemporaries. Some of the shot compositions are pretty striking, and the editing is done with more skill than you'd expect. I particularly love this sequence of Richard Jennings ascending the apartment stairs to discover the adulteress Claudia. Like many other roughies of the time, Flesh was filmed without synchronized sound, which normally plays as antiquated and clunky, but thanks to Michael's film history knowledge, one of the reasons I love Flesh is it plays like a demented silent movie. I think Michael's underrated as a filmmaker. Although the film shares some of the flaws of other exploitation films of its era, it's clunky in spots, and the pacing can be too slow thanks to the long, uninterrupted burlesque and go-go dancing sequences that actually make up a bulk of the film's scant running time. But that was also one of the raison d'etre of this kind of film, and delivers in that department. I had a hard time selecting clips that were appropriate for YouTube, if you know what I mean.
Boobies, boobies, boobies. Nothing but boobies.
Michael, by his own confession, had a Russ Meyer-esque fixation. And I don't mean their shared love of 1920s cinema.
Oh, you know I love big titties.
And the female cast consists of, should we say, well-rounded women in some state of undress. But pacing and my lack of titillation aside, I actually love those sequences. I love the dance routines and the hair and the makeup and the costumes on the performers. The thing I love the most are those garage rock B-sides on the soundtrack. I can't show those off here because the one business that's sleazier than the film business is the music business, but I've linked them down below for your auditory enjoyment. I love exploitation movies from this era because they're like a distorted window into another time. They're sleazy but simultaneously innocent. And the photography, the music, the fashion, the acting styles, and the dialogue all feel wonderfully surreal to me. If you love 60s sexploitation, most of my research for this show came from John Amero's autobiography, American Ecstasy, which is a great read. I've linked that down below too if you want to check that out. And speaking of things you should check out, join me next week for Richard Jennings' return in the second installment of the trio, Curse of Her Flesh. But until then, stay sick.